Have you ever wondered why when someone takes excessive alcohol, they always fail to have a balance? They cannot stand very well, they keep on staggering. And even when someone gives you a very hot slap at the back of this ospot here, you may start having issues with vision. What does that one tell you? It means we have those brain areas that are going to be depressed, which are controlling those kind of activities. Okay, good morning once again. In front of you is TUMNAD. In today's video, we are going to be focusing on what we call the different brain lobes and then the different sulci. But before we dive into this, please make sure you first subscribe, you turn on the notification bell so that whenever I load a video, you get notified. So let's go ahead and get started and look at what we call the brain lobes and then the sulci. Okay, so when we are talking about the brain lobes, we are going to be seeing that the brain, the cerebrum as a whole, we say it is the biggest structure, the biggest part of the brain, and it constitutes multiple of the lobes, and these lobes are also going to be responsible for different functions. Okay, so now the brain lobes, ideally there are four main brain lobes. Okay, there are only four main lobes. So here we have just brought a sagittal section. We have just brought a sagittal section and we are seeing it from the lateral side. Okay, so now these are the lobes which we can be seeing on our lateral side. So we are going to be starting to label one by one, and then finally we shall look at some of the functions that these lobes they play. Okay, and of course we're going to be having some of the different sulci. What are the sulci? The sulci, these are like more of the depressions. Okay, they are the depressions that are making sure that these lobes are differentiated from one another. Okay, so now we shall be seeing that there are some kind of depressions, there are some kind of the sulci that are going to be in between some of the lobes, meaning that they are the differentiating, they are the borderlines of different lobes. Okay, if you don't want to call it the sulcus, you may even call it the fissure. Okay, you may even call it the fissure. So we are starting with labeling the different parts, the different lobes of the brain. Okay, this one which is going to be at the back. Okay, this one which is going to be at the back, this one here is what we call the occipital, lobe. Okay, this one here is what we call the occipital, lobe. Okay, so now this occipital lobe is super very important. What are some of those functions that this occipital lobe part of the brain is playing? It is playing a couple of functions. First of all, it is where we're going to be having what we call the visual cortex. Okay, so where we are going to be having what we call the visual cortex. Okay, the primary visual cortex is going to be located in what we call the occipital lobe. So some of the main functions of this occipital lobe, we have the following. If you have anything, like for example, they bring something in front of you and you feel like you have seen it, that kind of sense of vision is going to be coming from the occipital lobe. So the first one is what we call vision. Okay, so now after seeing something, you need to first understand it, you need to comprehend it. Okay, so now it is not a matter of case of just seeing something, you need to understand it and see whether is it dangerous, is it friendly. So the whole of that kind of process is happening in the occipital lobe. So we shall call it visual interpretation. Okay, visual interpretation. So now you may see some of the things, but they are going to be of different colors, and they are going to be of different shape, and they are going to be of different sizes. All of those processes are going to be determined in what we call the occipital lobe. So now you are going to be able to differentiate. You are also going to be able to differentiate what we call colors, shape, and then also size. So now all of these functions are going to be played by what we call the occipital lobe. There are very many other functions. These are to mention but a few. Okay, so now that is what we call the occipital lobe. So now coming to the next one, you see this lobe here, the one which is now labeled in green. You see this lobe here, this lobe is what we call, this is what we call the parietal, lobe, okay? So now the parietal lobe is super very important. And this lobe is going to be playing a lot of roles. What are some of those roles that are going to be played by what we call the parietal lobe? The parietal lobe is going to be responsible for anything concerning with the sensations, what we call proprioception, and then also more of the sensory perception. Okay, more of the sensory perception. And when we talk of the sensory perception, we have a lot of the sensations which are going to be coming. One of the sensations which are going to be coming, we have what we call touch, we have what we call pain, we have what we call temperature, we have what we call pressure. So now all these kind of the sensory sensations are going to be perceived in this area which we are calling the parietal lobe. So now the parietal lobe is going to be separated from the occipital lobe. We have this kind of fissure which is going to be in the center here, okay? There is this type of fissure which is going to be here, okay? This type of fissure which is going to be here. It is separating the parietal lobe mainly from the parietal lobe and then occipital lobe. So now how do we call this kind of fissure? So now this kind of fissure or this kind of sulcus is what we call parietal occipital sulcus. Okay, parietal occipital sulcus. So it is that sulcus which is separating between the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Okay. Now let's go to another lobe which is super very important. You see this lobe which is very in the front. Okay, the fact that it is in the front, we simply call it the frontal lobe. Okay. So now this lobe here is what we call the frontal lobe. Okay, so now the frontal lobe, it does a lot of functions, but to mention but a few, the following are some of the functions which is going to be played by what we call the frontal lobe. Now the first one is going to be what we call thinking. Okay, our thinking ability is going to be coming from what we call the frontal lobe. Okay, another one is going to be reasoning. Okay, another one is going to be reasoning. Our reasoning capacity is going to be determined by what we call the centers in what we call the frontal lobe. Another one is what we call speech. Okay, what we call speech. So now our speech is going to determine in the frontal lobe, and mainly we have what we call that area, what we call the Broca's area. Okay, so now our speech is going to be determined in that area. Okay, again, another one is what we call our emotions. So some people are too emotional, but I want you to know that the lobe is going to be responsible for this kind of emotions is going to be the what we call the frontal lobe. And then also we have other functions like moods, and then also personality. Or we also have others like ability to attention. Okay, what we call attention. Okay, attention is also going to be under what we call the frontal lobe control. And then lastly, the last one is what we call problem solving. Okay, problem solving. So now all of these what I've listed here are going to be under the control of what we call the frontal lobe. Okay, so now the frontal lobe is super very important in thinking, reasoning, speech, emotions, mood, attention, and problem solving. But now The parietal lobe is going to be separated from the frontal lobe by this kind of very much important fissure. How do we call this kind of fissure? This kind of fissure here. This fissure is what we call, this one here is what we call the central sulcus. Okay? Is what we call the central, sulcus. Okay? Is what we call the central sulcus. Okay, so now the central sulcus is going to be dividing the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Okay, but now we need to first understand there are some kind of key important structures just immediately after this sulcus. You see this gyrus, which is just the first one as you move to the parietal lobe. It has another name. This kind of the gyrus, which is just posterior to the central sulcus, it is called, this kind of gyrus here, it is what we call post-central. It is called the post-central gyrus. Okay, it is what we call post-central gyrus. And that post-central gyrus, it has a very important area. We call it the primary somatosensory area. Okay, so now the primary somatosensory area is going to be located on the post-central gyrus. Okay, and then we have this kind of the gyrus, which is just the first one as you start to move ahead into the frontal lobe. How do we call this kind of first gyrus, which is just going to be just after what we call the central sulcus in front? They call this one as they call it as what we call pre-central gyrus. Okay, pre-central gyrus. And there is a very important area which is going to be located in that area. How do we call that one? We call that one as what we call the primary motor cortex, or even primary motor area. You may even call it the primary motor cortex. Okay, so now these two kind of the gyrus are super important. So now coming down here, we have again another lobe. How do we call this lobe, which is just going to be just on the temporal bone, just close to the ear? This kind of lobe down here, this lobe is what we call the temporal lobe. Okay, so now this temporal lobe is also super very important. What are some of the roles of what we call the temporal lobes? This one here, we have what we call auditory cortex. The primary auditory cortex is going to be located in what we call the temporal lobe. And when I talk about the auditory cortex, you have to be knowing that here you're going to be having perception of what we call hearing. Okay, so here we are going to be having our hearing ability taking place in what we call the temporal lobe. Okay. We also have another function of the temporal lobe as what we call language. Okay, what we call language understanding. Okay, so now language understanding is also going to be part of what we call the temporal lobe. And of course, language understanding is going to be into another area. There's that area which we call it the Wernicke's, area. Okay, the Wernicke's area is going to be responsible for language interpretation and language understanding. Some kind of behavior. The last one being memory. Memory can also be part of what we call the temporal lobe, the short and then the long-term memory. Okay, so now we realize that this lobe is also doing a very important role. So now this temporal lobe is going to be separated from the frontal lobe by this kind of fissure here. This kind of fissure here, you see this fissure is going to be coming here, and then at the same time it can even slightly cross to the other side. So how do we call this kind of fissure? It's going to be more of separating the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe, and also to a small extent also going to be separating also to what we call the parietal lobe. How do we call this kind of fissure what called the sulcus? They call this one as what we call the lateral. They call it what we call the lateral sulcus. Okay, they call it what we call the lateral sulcus. We may even call it the lateral fissure. It is going to be separating between the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe, and even also what we call the parietal lobe. Okay, so now those are the four main types of lobes, but there is another type of lobe which they rarely talk about, but it is called the insular lobe, but they rarely talk about. Okay, so we shall not go much into that. Okay, I want to talk about this kind of structure here. Okay, this structure is not a lobe. It's not a lobe, but is super very important part of the brain. So now this one here is what we call cerebellum. Okay, and with the cerebellum, it has a lot of functions. What are some of those functions which are going to be controlled by what we call the cerebellum? The most important one which I want you to note is what we call balance, and also coordinating the movement. Okay, what we call coordination of movement. And then lastly, when you take excessive alcohol, you may fail to maintain what we call posture, meaning that posture is also going to be under the control of what we call the cerebellum. So now those are some of the important areas which are going to be helping in determining what kind of response is going to be generated by what we call this part of the central nervous system, which we are calling the brain. Okay, and then of course you're going to be having here this is the medulla oblongata. This is going to be the pons, and they are also going to be aiding in what we call some of the autonomic functions, like the heart rate. From the medulla oblongata, heart rate, the blood pressure, and then also the respiratory rate are also going to be under the control of what we call the medulla oblongata, which is part of the spinal of the brain stem. Okay, so just having a quick recap of what we have just talked about, we said that the brain has the cerebrum has what we call four main lobes. We said the first lobe is going to be the occipital lobe, which is going to be having the visual cortex, which is going to be responsible for vision, visual interpretation, differentiating colors, shape, and size. Okay, we went ahead and said that the parietal lobe is going to be this one here, and it's going to be having what we call responsible for what we call the proprioception, and then sensory perception of different sensations like touch, pain, temperature, pressure. We said that we have what we call the frontal lobe, and this frontal lobe is going to be responsible for the following: thinking, reasoning, speech, having what we call the Broca's area, emotions, mood, personality, attention, problem solving, all are going to be under the control of what we call the frontal lobe. We said that we have this kind of depression, what we call the sulcus or the fissure, which is separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. We said this one is what we call the central sulcus. We said the first gyrus at the back of the central sulcus to the parietal lobe, we said is what we call the post-central gyrus, which is going to be containing what we call the primary somatosensory area. Okay? Then we said that the first gyrus just in front of the central sulcus has got the frontal lobe. We said it is called the precentral gyrus, which is going to be having the primary motor cortex or primary motor area. Okay. Then we also said that the sulcus, which is going to be separating the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe, we said is what we call the parieto-occipital sulcus or parieto-occipital fissure, which is going to be separating the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Okay. Then we went ahead and talked about this kind of lobe here, which we are calling the temporal lobe, which is just located in the temporal bone here in the ear. We said it's having what we call the auditory cortex, and it's going to be responsible for the following functions: hearing, language interpretation, because it's going to be having what we call the Wernicke's area, the behavior, and then memory. And then finally, we summed up with this kind of structure, which we are calling the cerebellum, that's going to be aiding in what we call balance, coordination of the movement, and then also helping in what we call in what we call posture. And then finally, we said that about the brainstem, more especially the medulla oblongata, is going to be responsible for some of the autonomic functions like heart rate, respiratory rate, and then also a regulation of the blood pressure, and very many other autonomic functions going to be coming from what we call the brainstem. Okay. This really covers what we call the brain lobes and then the different sulci. It has been very cool. I'm sure you have picked something. And please, if you have picked something and you read that you have benefited from this video, please, you can support me. And you can support me by a couple of means. The only one, you can do you can like the video. You can comment in the comment section. You can also share the video to the friends that you think that this video is helping. And don't forget to subscribe at the end of it all. Thank you very much for listening to me, TUMNAD, as always. Until we meet next time.